Watauga County, North Carolina. September 1897, the mountain wind cut through the valley like a blade, carrying the scent of coming winter. Angus McTavish stood before a pile of white oak logs, his weathered hands running across bark still wet from felling. At 67, the Scottish carpenter had spent more years working wood than most men lived. But on this crisp autumn morning, watching him mark his first corner joint, the younger builders gathered nearby weren't showing respect. They were barely hiding their smirks. "Dovetails," muttered James Bradley, a 42-year-old carpenter from the lowlands. The old man's still cutting dovetails. Like we're building furniture, not cabins. What those modern builders dismissed as outdated Highland stubbornness would prove to be one of the most sophisticated understandings of wood behavior ever applied to frontier construction. What did this aging immigrant understand about thermal expansion, grain direction, and compression dynamics that men half his age, men with newer methods and confident swagger, had completely missed? Before we reveal the secret that kept Angus's cabin windproof through 55 brutal mountain winters, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why this outdated technique is being rediscovered by master timber framers today. And you might just want to apply it yourself. The autumn of 1897 brought more than falling leaves to the North Carolina highlands. It brought change. New timber frame methods were arriving from Pennsylvania and Virginia. Faster techniques, simpler joints, less labor. Square notching had become the standard. For cuts, stack the logs, pack the gaps with clay and moss. A man could raise a cabin wall in half the time it took to hand-carve traditional joinery. Angus McTavish wanted no part of it. On his building site 3 miles up the valley from Boone, he worked alone, scribing each log with deliberate precision. His dovetail layout was exacting. A 14-degree angle on the tail, 18 inches of bearing surface extending into each adjoining wall. He rejected 12 logs before finding 8 white oak timbers with a grain orientation he demanded. Perfectly vertical growth rings, no spiral, harvested on the north face of the ridge where growth was slowest and with density highest. "You planning to finish before snow flies, old man?" Bradley called out one October morning, riding past with 2 assistants. "Or are you going to carve decorations on every stick?" Bradley's own cabin, 200 yards downslope, was already topped out. Square-notched corners, poplar logs chosen for their light weight and easy working. He'd raised his walls in 11 days. Angus had been working for 23 and hadn't reached half height. The local community watched with mixed fascination and frustration. Angus's method required each log to be scribed individually to the one below. No 2 joints identical. The dovetail tails had to be cut with handsaws and slicks, the sockets chiseled by eye and feel. It was Highland craftsmanship transported across an ocean, and in Watauga County in 1897, it looked like a stubborn old man's refusal to accept that the world had moved on. "It's unnecessary labor," Bradley told a gathering at the trading post. "Waste a third more time for corners that'll settle same as square notches. Old country nonsense." But Angus continued. Each tail, each socket, each bearing surface checked and rechecked. He worked green logs, timber cut less than 3 weeks prior, moisture content still above 30%. When asked why he didn't let the wood season, he simply said, "They'll season in place." That's when the work begins. The experienced builders shook their heads. Greenwood would shrink. Gaps would open. More chinking, more maintenance, more trouble. Everyone knew you wanted dry, stable timber. Everyone, apparently, except Angus McTavish. By late November, with the first hard frost silvering the meadow grass, Angus finally set his ridgepole. His cabin stood complete. For walls of white oak, each corner joint a masterwork of angled geometry that seemed, to the casual observer, like nothing more than excessive pride in outdated methods. What none of them understood yet was that Angus hadn't built his corners to look traditional. He'd built them to move. Wood is not static. Every timber framer knows this intellectually, but few grasp its implications the way Angus McTavish did. Each log in a cabin wall is a complex biological structure, and it behaves according to rules as precise as any law of physics. White oak shrinks approximately 5.6% across its width as it dries from green to equilibrium moisture content. But along its length, parallel to the grain, it shrinks only 0.3%. This differential movement was what Angus had designed for. In a square notch corner, logs rest horizontally on each other, held by gravity and friction. As they dry and shrink, they compress downward, and the corner joint tightens, but only vertically. Horizontally, across the width of each log, shrinkage creates gaps at the joint faces. These gaps, typically 1 to 3 inches across a 12-inch log, become wind channels. They require constant maintenance, perpetual rechinking, and they're why square-notch cabins drafty even when new. Angus's dovetail worked differently. His 14-degree angle wasn't arbitrary. It matched the ratio between radial shrinkage and tangential shrinkage in white oak with vertical grain orientation. As the wood dried, it compressed inward, but because of the angle-bearing surfaces, that compression translated into lateral force. The joint didn't just tighten downward. It tightened sideways, pulling the walls together. The 18-inch bearing surface provided massive contact area. Each corner joint had 72 square inches of wood-to-wood contact, compared to 36 in a standard square notch. More surface meant more friction, more compression distribution, more resistance to twisting and racking. But the genius was in the timing. Angus had used green logs deliberately. As they seasoned in place over the first 2 years, they would shrink approximately 9% of their diameter. A 12-inch log would become 11 inches. In a square notch, that's simply lost dimension. In Angus's dovetails, that shrinkage pulled the tails deeper into their sockets, like wedges being driven home. He'd calculated it by observation, not mathematics. 50 years of watching would move, watching joints fail, watching gaps appear. He knew that white oak cut in autumn, built green in November, and allowed to season through 2 freeze-thaw cycles would reach equilibrium by the 3rd summer. And he knew that if the geometry was right, every millimeter of shrinkage would work for him, not against him. The wood does the chinking, he told his grandson that winter, watching ice form on the window glass. You just have to give it the right path to follow. It was engineering disguised as tradition. The accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned through cold winters and failed joints what angles worked and what didn't. No university degree required. Just attention, patience, and respect for material behavior. What Angus didn't know was that within 8 weeks, the first brutal test of his design would arrive. And everyone in Watauga County would be counting logs consumed and degrees of warmth retained. January 14th, 1898, 4:30 a.m., the temperature hit -12 Fahrenheit. Not uncommon for the North Carolina highlands, but brutal nonetheless. By dawn, frost had painted inch-thick patterns on every window in the valley, and wood smoke rose from 24 chimneys in vertical columns. The still, dead air of deep cold. James Bradley woke in his new cabin to a familiar sensation, wind on his face. Not the roar of a gale, but the insidious whisper of infiltration, cold air seeping through gaps he couldn't see but felt constantly. He'd chinked those corners 3 times already. Clay and moss, packed tight in September. By November, gaps had reappeared. He'd rechunked with oakum and limestone putty. Now in January, he could feel air moving again. The interior temperature, measured by a mercury thermometer hanging near his stove, read 43 degrees. His firebox glowed orange with a full load of oak splits, consuming wood at a rate that would empty his shed by March if the winter held. 200 yards upslope, Angus McTavish's cabin told a different story. No wind. The interior air was still, almost heavy. The thermometer near his hearth, smaller than Bradley's stove, burning a load half the size, read 61 degrees. Angus sat at his table, wearing a single wool shirt, drinking coffee and watching the first light touch the ridge across the valley. His grandson, visiting for the week, had walked the perimeter that morning with a candle. Old trick. Hold a flame near suspected gaps and watch for flicker. He checked every corner, every joint between logs. The candle burned vertical and steady. No drafts. No air infiltration. The cabin was sealed. The mathematics were undeniable. Bradley's cabin, with approximately 2,800 square feet of wall surface, was losing heat through corner gaps estimated at 36 linear feet total. Thin cracks, barely visible, but enough to create convective loops that pulled warm air out and cold air in. His square-notch corners, despite 3 rounds of chinking, had opened quarter-inch gaps at multiple joints. Physics did the rest. Angus's dovetails had no gaps. The white oak, now 15 months into its drying cycle, had shrunk exactly as predicted. But instead of opening spaces, that shrinkage had compressed the joints tighter. The 14-degree angles converted vertical load into horizontal pressure. Each log pressed against its neighbors with an estimated 400 pounds of force per corner, enough to crush any attempt by air to find passage. The result? Bradley burned 43% more wood that January. His cabin never exceeded 50 degrees on the coldest nights. Angus maintained low 60s comfort with half the fuel consumption and a quarter of the labor tending fire. Word spread slowly at first. A few neighbors noticed that Angus's woodshed was still full in February, while Bradley made a third trip to his timber lot. Questions were asked quietly. How much wood are you burning? What's your interior temperature running? The answers were uncomfortable for men who'd mocked the old Scotsman's outdated methods. If you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten building wisdom, hit that like button and subscribe, because the real revelation comes in Chapter 5, when university researchers measure this cabin 55 years later. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever seen dovetail log corners in person? But 1898 was just the beginning. A single winter could be anomaly, could be luck, could be Angus burning better wood, or positioning his cabin more favorably to sun. The true test wouldn't come for another decade and a half, when time itself would separate proven design from temporary fortune. April 1912, James Bradley stood in his cabin doorway, coffee in hand, watching morning sun illuminate the gaps in his corners. 14 years had not been kind to his square-notch construction. What began as hairline cracks had become fingers-width separations at 6 of his 8 corners. The upper logs, which had settled 3 inches as expected, had also twisted slightly, a natural consequence of unequal drying in wood with mixed grain orientation. Each gap required maintenance. He'd rechunked every corner at least 8 times. The current solution, oakum twisted with horsehair and sealed with pine pitch, would hold until autumn, maybe. Then he'd do it again and again. It was the price of building fast, building modern, building with methods that saved time up front but extracted payment in perpetual maintenance. 3 miles up the valley, Angus McTavish's cabin looked almost unchanged from the day he'd finished it. The white oak logs had darkened to rich brown-gray, weathered but sound. The corners, those laboriously carved dovetails that had provoked so much mockery in 1897, showed no gaps at all. More remarkably, they'd grown tighter over time. The physics were elegant. As the logs had dried and shrunk, the angled bearing surfaces had converted that dimensional change into lateral compression. The joints hadn't just settled, they'd self-tightened. Each log weighed between 300 and 400 pounds, stacked 12 high at each corner. That created nearly 5,000 pounds of downward force. The 14-degree dovetail angle translated approximately 30% of that vertical load into horizontal compression, roughly 1,500 pounds of lateral force pulling the walls together. It was a compression joint that increased pressure as it aged, the opposite of square notching, which loosened over time. By 1912, 3 builders in Watauga County had quietly adopted modified versions of Angus's technique. Not full dovetails. The labor requirement was still prohibitive for commercial work, but angled notches with extended bearing surfaces. 12 degrees instead of 14. 16 inches of contact instead of 18. Compromises, but compromises that worked. One of those builders, Thomas Garrett, had constructed a barn using 10-degree notches in 1909. 3 years later, he performed a simple test. He took a thin piece of paper and tried to slide it into the corner joints. He couldn't. The wood-to-wood contact was so complete that even paper couldn't penetrate. His square-notch barn from 1905, by contrast, had gaps he could fit his thumb into. Angus, now 82, rarely worked anymore. Arthritis had bent his hands, and his eyesight had dimmed. But he still walked his cabin's perimeter every few months, running those twisted fingers along the corners, feeling for what he couldn't see clearly. The joints were solid. No movement, no air, no moisture penetration. The cabin would outlast him, he knew. Probably outlast his grandson. The mockery had stopped years ago. Men who'd laughed in 1897 now asked polite questions. Could he sketch the joint geometry? What was the minimum acceptable angle? Did species matter? Would pine work or only oak? Angus answered when he could, but often his responses frustrated questioners. You feel it, he'd say. The wood tells you when it's right. He couldn't express in numbers what he understood through decades of cutting and fitting. The 14-degree angle wasn't calculated. It was discovered through iteration. The 18-inch bearing surface wasn't designed. It was what felt stable when tested. Modern builders wanted formulas. Angus had only experience. But experience, it turned out, was enough. His cabin stood as proof. 15 winters, 15 thaws, 15 cycles of expansion and contraction. No gaps, no drafts, no failures. The outdated method had become the durable one. The modern technique required constant repair. Time was rendering its verdict, slow but decisive. And time, as the next 4 decades would prove, had a great deal more to reveal. October 1952, Watauga County, North Carolina, 55 years after Angus McTavish raised a ridgepole on his dovetail cabin. A team of forestry students from the University of Tennessee arrived with instruments that would have seemed like magic to the old Scotsman. Anemometers to measure air velocity. Psychrometers for humidity gradients. Even a primitive thermal imaging device. War surplus technology repurposed for building science research. The cabin was now occupied by Angus's grandson, Robert, a 53-year-old schoolteacher who'd grown up listening to stories about his grandfather's foolish building methods. Robert had maintained the structure minimally. Roof repairs, 1 chimney repoint, regular stove cleaning. But the corners? He'd never touched them. Never needed to. The research team, led by Professor Edmund Castellaw, was studying thermal performance in historical construction. They'd examined 14 cabins built between 1890 and 1910, measuring air infiltration rates, structural integrity, and comparing them against modern 1950s construction standards. The McTavish cabin broke their expectations. Using a blower door test, a technique adapted from industrial air sealing research, they pressurized the interior to 50 pascals and measured air leakage. Modern frame houses of the era typically showed 15 to 20 air changes per hour at that pressure. Well-built log cabins averaged 8 to 12. Square-notch corners were the primary culprit, creating convective channels that pulled conditioned air out and exterior air in. The McTavish cabin measured 2.3 air changes per hour. That can't be right, Castellaw said, checking his gauges. Run it again. They ran it 3 times. The result held. The dovetail corners, now seasoned for 55 years, were so tight that air infiltration was comparable to modern houses with weather stripping and caulked seams. The white oak had compressed, locked, and sealed itself into a barrier that approached laboratory-grade airtightness. The structural analysis was equally remarkable. Using dial indicators, they measured corner deflection under controlled lateral load. They applied 150 pounds of horizontal force to the walls, simulating wind pressure equivalent to a 60-mile-per-hour gale. The corners moved less than 1/16 of an inch. For comparison, a square-notch cabin tested the previous week had shown 3/8-inch movement under the same load. The dovetail geometry was distributing stress across 72 square inches of contact surface per corner. That massive bearing area, combined with decades of compression and the natural interlocking of the angled surfaces, had created joints with tensile strength approaching that of modern mechanical fasteners. But the most dramatic revelation came from thermal imaging. On a 40-degree October evening, They heated the cabin interior to 68 degrees and scanned the walls with their infrared detector. Modern frame construction showed heat loss concentrated at studs, corners, and penetrations, bright spots where thermal bridges conducted energy outward. Square-notch log cabins showed dramatic heat loss at corner joints, visible as glowing lines in the thermal image. The McTavish cabin showed almost nothing. The corners were dark, the same temperature as the surrounding log mass. Heat wasn't escaping through the joints because there were no gaps for convective transfer. The entire wall assembly functioned as a single thermal mass, storing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. This outperforms contemporary construction, Costello wrote in his field notes. 55-year-old vernacular technology exceeding 1952 building standards. Implications require further study. The team spent 3 days documenting measurements, photographing joints, and interviewing Robert about maintenance history. The answer was simple. There was none. The cabin had maintained itself through differential wood movement and geometric compression, exactly as Angus had intended, though he'd never used those terms. When a research paper was published in the Journal of Forestry Products in 1953, it included a sentence that would have made Angus smile. Traditional joinery methods dismissed as primitive often represent empirical solutions to problems modern engineering is only beginning to quantify. By then, James Bradley's square-notch cabin had been abandoned for 7 years. The structure still stood, but gaps at the corners had allowed moisture penetration, which led to rot, which led to structural instability. It would collapse entirely by 1959. The McTavish cabin would still be occupied in 2010, 113 years after construction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. If this story of forgotten building wisdom resonates with you, subscribe now and hit that like button. Comment below. What traditional technique from your region do you think modern builders have forgotten? Let's keep this knowledge alive together. 1955, Appalachian Region. The publication of Costello's research paper did something unexpected. It made an 85-year-old building technique suddenly relevant again. Within 3 years of the study's publication, 23 cabins across 3 counties, Watauga, Avery, and Mitchell, incorporated modified dovetail corners. Not exact replicas of Angus's design, but adaptations. Some builders used 12-degree angles instead of 14, reasoning that shallower cuts required less precision. Others extended bearing surfaces to 20 inches, figuring more contact meant more stability. What they all shared was recognition that the old man's foolishness had actually been sophisticated materials engineering. Thomas Garrett, now 71 and still building, became an unofficial evangelist for angled corner joints. He'd simplified the design for commercial viability. He called them compression notches, cutting them with a chainsaw and slick instead of hand tools. The labor requirement dropped by 60%, making them economical for timber frame construction. By 1958, his method had spread to Virginia and Tennessee. But something was lost in translation. Garrett's simplified version worked. His cabins were tight and durable, but they weren't quite as tight as Angus's originals. The difference was in details Garrett didn't fully understand. The specific moisture content of the logs when cut, the grain orientation Angus had insisted on, the relationship between angle and bearing surface that created optimal compression ratios. Angus had never written down his process. He'd worked by feel, by experience, by accumulated generations of Highland building tradition brought across the Atlantic and adapted to American timber. When he died in 1931 at age 98, that knowledge died with him. Or rather, it survived only in the physical structures he'd built. This is the pattern of vernacular engineering. Solutions are discovered through iteration, refined through necessity, and transmitted through demonstration. They work brilliantly in specific contexts, but they're fragile. They depend on master craftsmen willing to teach and students willing to learn slowly. When that chain breaks, when modern methods promise speed and efficiency, the old knowledge scatters like leaves. By 1970, angle corner notching had become a niche technique practiced by maybe 200 timber framers across the eastern United States. Most builders used simpler methods. fewer still understood why the angles mattered, why grain orientation was critical, why green logs performed differently than seasoned timber. But then something else happened, the energy crisis. When oil prices spiked in 1973 and heating costs tripled, people suddenly cared about thermal performance. The Back to the Land movement brought thousands of young people to rural areas, building cabins, try to live off-grid, desperate for techniques that reduced energy consumption. They rediscovered Angus McTavish's cabin, still standing, still occupied, still windproof after 76 years. A new generation studied those corners, measured those angles, attempted replication. Some succeeded. Many didn't. They lacked the material knowledge, the wood sense, the understanding that you can't separate the joint geometry from the timber selection, from the construction timing, from the seasoning process. It's a system, not a single technique. Today, in 2024, high-end timber framers charge premium rates for authentic dovetail log corners. The technique has been rediscovered by architects interested in passive house design and ultra-low energy consumption. Modern engineering can now quantify what Angus understood intuitively. That 14-degree angles in vertical grain white oak, cut green and season in place, create compression ratios that increase over time rather than decreasing. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We needed university studies, thermal imaging, and blower door tests to prove what an 87-year-old immigrant carpenter knew in 1897 through nothing more than paying attention to how wood behaves. It's a reminder, perhaps the most important one this story offers, that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. Those outdated methods weren't relics of a less sophisticated time. They were empirical solutions developed over centuries, tested by the harshest judge imaginable: survival through winter. Angus McTavish didn't have engineering degrees or thermal imaging equipment. He had something potentially more valuable: respect for his material and the patience to learn from it. He watched wood move. He noticed patterns. He tested angles and bearing surfaces until he found combinations that worked. Then he built accordingly. That's not primitive. That's science in its purest form. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, refinement. It just doesn't come with equations or university credentials, so we mistake it for superstition. The McTavish cabin stands today as physical evidence of this truth. The corners Angus cut in 1897 are still tight in 2024. No gaps, no drafts, no failures. 127 years of weather, and the joints are sound. Modern construction is lucky to last 50 years without major maintenance. But then again, modern construction rarely has the benefit of craftsmen who understand their materials at the level Angus did, who know that if you listen to the wood, respect its nature, and work with its movement instead of against it, it will reward you with performance that outlasts the builder, his children, and probably his grandchildren. That's the legacy. Not just tight corners, but a way of thinking about construction. Work with the material, not against it. Let physics do the labor. Build systems that improve with time rather than degrade. If this documentary opened your eyes to the engineering hidden in traditional building methods, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Comment below with your location and tell me, what other primitive techniques do you think deserve scientific validation? Let's build a community that respects both modern engineering and ancestral wisdom. Because sometimes the old way isn't the wrong way. It's just the way we forgot to remember. This documentary is educational and historical in nature. While the McTavish cabin and the techniques described are based on extensive research of Appalachian vernacular architecture and timber frame construction methods, specific building projects should always follow local codes and consult with licensed engineers. Traditional techniques offer valuable lessons, but modern safety standards exist for important reasons. The physics of wood movement, thermal mass, and compression joinery described here are scientifically accurate. Dovetail log corners, when properly executed with appropriate timber selection and moisture management, do create self-tightening joints with superior air-sealing properties. However, replication requires significant skill, material knowledge, and attention to detail. Angus MacTavish's story represents countless immigrant craftsmen who brought old-world building knowledge to America and adapted it to new contexts. Their contributions to vernacular architecture deserve recognition and study.